The learning objective of this chapter is to understand how an enclosed space entry operation is closed out. Once the task inside the enclosed or confined space is finished, the following items must be completed. Click on the tasks for more information. Personnel were tallied into the space by the watchman at the commencement of the entry operation. The reverse must now take place. The watchman must tally them out again, handing back the personal tags or gaining a second set of signatures on the tally board. In this way, it will be immediately apparent if someone is missing and still inside the space. Account for equipment. It is essential that all equipment is also accounted for, as a rag or hand brush can easily be drawn into a pump or valve at a later stage and damage or block it, with serious consequences. One of the last tasks of the entry team before exiting is to check around the area in which they have been working and remove any gear. If the work inside is completed and all personnel have left the space, it should be secured again by removing any gas-free tags, stopping ventilation, unless instructed otherwise by the responsible officer because the space is to be entered again later, withdrawing any air lines, electrical leads, ejectors, ropes and other similar equipment, and closing any lids, again unless instructed otherwise by the responsible officer because the space is to be entered later. In effect, the space is to be returned to the pre-entry condition. All equipment used for the entry procedure and for the task performed should be cleaned, checked, and returned to its correct storage location. Test meters should be purged, switched off, and returned to the control room or safety locker, as applicable. Breathing apparatus should be cleaned, and, if of the self-contained type, bottles recharged and the sets returned to their racks. Flashlights, lifelines and other safety equipment should be cleaned, checked and stored. And personal protective clothing should be decontaminated if required, cleaned, ventilated and returned to the safety locker. If working valves were secured prior to the entry taking place, they must be unlocked again and made ready for normal use. Similarly, if tags were placed on control panels, they too must be removed. The securing of the space and the return of equipment will normally be reported verbally between the crew members involved and the responsible officer, but where items of equipment have been withdrawn against a written log, they should be signed back in on return. Where applicable, the officer on watch and the duty engineer should also be advised that the planned task has been completed. The exact nature of final written reports or entries on controlled documents such as logbook entries or closing out an enclosed space entry permit, will be determined by the company's safety management system and the nature of the task inside the space. In any event, the records must be filed and kept for the required period. Note that they may subsequently be examined by an auditor or inspector. The learning. This incident involves a chemical tanker which had stainless steel center tanks, with coated wing tanks on either side. Her crew was comprised of men of several nationalities. The ship was in ballast and had just finished cleaning tanks. They were in the final stages of mopping and drying in preparation for the next cargo. The chief officer, who had been on deck throughout, was closely supervising the operation, although the details of the enclosed space entry permits are not available. The tanks had, however, already been gas-freed the previous day, and the deck crew had been inside for ejecting and mopping. The chief officer had also been inside all of them for inspection. On the day of the incident, the deck crew was divided into 2 teams of 2 seamen each, in order to speed up the final preparations. It eventually became a practice that they went in and out of the tanks with minimal supervision by the chief officer or attendants from the deck. The afternoon coffee break came, and the deck was suddenly deserted. The officer on watch on the bridge saw dark clouds approaching, and it soon started to rain heavily. The watchman was sent to inform the crew of the rain. 2 men were sent on deck to close the tank lids. Many of the tanks were almost in load-ready condition, and it was important that they did not get rainwater inside. The 2 men hurried from lid to lid, swinging them over and throwing the securing dogs on, with a few quick turns to each. The rain eventually passed, and the pumpman went out to once again check the tanks. He was halfway through tightening the dogs on number 5 centre tank lid when he heard a faint knocking coming from inside the tank. He immediately opened the lid back up and found the chief officer clinging onto the ladder, breathing heavily. He had one safety shoe in his hand and was weakly banging at the inside of the tank hatch. Luckily, he was only suffering from shock and fatigue. Failure to observe basic enclosed space entry procedures and the independent actions of the chief officer primarily led to this near-miss incident.